August 5th, 2023. A small Florida town wakes to a chilling discovery. Inside a newlywed couple's home, the bride lies lifeless, her dreams of a future extinguished within just 24 hours of saying, "I do." Her husband, a decorated sheriff and pillar of the community, insists it was a tragic accident. But as investigators peel back the layers, the picture-perfect facade begins to crack. What did she uncover on her wedding night that made her a target? How far would a man sworn to uphold the law go to protect his darkest secret? And what twisted truths are hiding in plain sight? Stay with us as we unravel a story of love, betrayal, and unimaginable horror. You won't believe where this journey will take you. She was 29, a nurse whose life revolved around helping others. Her colleagues admired her dedication, her patients praised her gentle touch, and her friends spoke of her unshakable kindness. She had a way of making people feel safe, understood, and cared for. He was the embodiment of authority and discipline. As a sheriff, he was a man trusted by his community, a figure of law and order. His record was spotless, his reputation unblemished. To many, he was the kind of man others aspired to be, a protector, a leader, and now, a husband. Their wedding was a celebration of what seemed like a perfect union. Close family and friends gathered under the bright Florida sun to witness their vows. Her radiant smile lit up the ceremony, and his composed demeanor hinted at pride and quiet joy. The photographs captured moments of laughter, tears of happiness, and the promises of a lifetime together. But less than 24 hours later, the promise of forever was shattered. Inside the walls of their new home, her body was found. Lifeless, silent, gone. The sheriff was the first to call for help, his voice steady but strained as he reported a break-in. He described the scene with precision, a violent struggle, an intruder fleeing into the night, and his desperate attempt to save his new wife. It was a story that should have explained everything, but instead it raised unsettling questions. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. No neighbors heard screams or saw anyone fleeing. The timeline he described felt off, like a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. And yet, there he stood, the grieving husband, the respected sheriff, telling a story that some were desperate to believe and others couldn't ignore. As investigators began to dig deeper, they would uncover a web of secrets and lies so tangled it would challenge everything the town thought they knew about the man they had trusted. But before the truth could come to light, they had to answer one crucial question. What happened in the hours between the vows and the tragedy? The answers were there, hidden in the details, waiting to be pieced together. And as they came to light, they would reveal a story far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. In the days leading up to their wedding, things seemed perfect on the surface. A couple preparing for their future, family and friends buzzing with excitement, and the anticipation of a new chapter. But beneath the facade of happiness, small cracks began to appear, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. She noticed things, little things that didn't seem to add up. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Meetings he described as work emergencies that stretched long into the night. And then there were the moments when she caught him distracted, his eyes distant, his demeanor tense, as though carrying the weight of something unspoken. At first, she dismissed it. Wedding stress, she told herself. After all, he was a sheriff. His job demanded discretion, and she trusted him. But as the days wore on, her unease grew harder to ignore. One evening, while tidying his home office, she stumbled across something unusual, a locked drawer in his desk. It was a detail she had never noticed before, and the thought lingered in her mind. Why would he need to keep something locked away in their home? What could be so private that he wouldn't share it with her? Her curiosity gnawed at her, and soon, She found herself searching for answers. It started innocently enough. Questions casually woven into their conversations, probing for clarity without raising suspicion. But the answers he gave were vague, evasive, and left her feeling more unsettled than before. Then came the notes. Cryptic, hastily scrawled pieces of paper she found discarded in the trash or tucked into the pages of his notebooks. Names, dates, addresses, details that seemed unrelated but felt important. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to something much larger. Unable to quiet her growing doubts, she decided to dig deeper. Late at night, while he was out, she found herself drawn to that locked drawer. She didn't know what she was looking for, but when she finally managed to open it, what she found stopped her cold. Inside were documents that painted a picture she could hardly comprehend. Bank statements with unaccounted-for deposits, photos of individuals she didn't recognize, and detailed records of transactions that hinted at something criminal. At first, she thought it was drug dealing, an ugly, dangerous secret, but one she could still rationalize, if only barely. But the deeper she went, the more disturbing the connections became. Names she recognized from the news, cases he had worked on as sheriff, pieces that suggested his involvement wasn't just on the fringes, it was central. It wasn't just drug dealing. It was something far worse, something she hadn't fully grasped yet, but knew was far beyond what she had imagined. The man she was about to marry, the man she thought she knew, was keeping secrets that could shatter everything. And as her wedding day approached, she found herself torn between the love she felt and the fear that her instincts were leading her into dangerous territory. What she didn't know was that her search for the truth wasn't just uncovering his secrets, it was sealing her fate. August 5th, 2023. It was a day that should have been etched in memory as the start of a beautiful life together. The morning sun bathed the venue in a soft glow, the air filled with laughter and the scent of fresh flowers. Family and friends gathered, their faces beaming with joy as they watched the couple prepare to exchange vows. Every detail had been planned to perfection: the venue, the music, the food. It was the kind of day that felt like it belonged in a fairy tale. The bride was radiant in her gown, her smile lighting up the room. Cameras captured each moment: the walk down the aisle, the exchange of rings, the vows spoken with trembling voices. When they said, "I do," there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. The sheriff stood proud, a picture of devotion as he gazed at his new wife. The reception was a celebration of their love. Guests toasted to their future, clinking glasses filled with champagne. There was laughter, dancing, and heartfelt speeches. In every photo, they appeared as the perfect couple, inseparable, in love, and ready to face the world together. But behind her smile, the bride's heart was heavy. For days, the unease had grown, her mind circling back to the locked drawer, the cryptic notes, and the unanswered questions. She had planned to wait, to keep the day focused on joy and celebration, but the weight of her suspicions was unbearable. As the evening wore on, she watched him closely. His interactions, his laughter, his seemingly effortless charm. To everyone else, he was a devoted husband, a respected sheriff, a man of integrity. But to her, his every move felt calculated, every word tinged with a layer of something she couldn't quite place. When the guests finally began to leave and the noise of the celebration faded, she made her decision. Tonight, she would confront him. She would ask the questions she had been holding back, demand the answers she deserved. As they stood together, smiling for one last photo, her mind raced. What would she say? How would he react? Was she prepared for the truth she might uncover? She told herself it was the right thing to do, that as his wife she had a right to know. But in the back of her mind, a quiet voice warned her that the man she was about to face might not be the man she thought she knew. That night, the house was quiet. The celebration was over, the guests were gone, and the reality of their new life together was just beginning. She waited until they were alone, until the lights were dimmed and the world outside seemed far away. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to speak the words that would change everything. What she didn't know was that her confrontation wouldn't lead to clarity. It wouldn't bring the answers she sought or the relief she hoped for. Instead, it would set into motion a chain of events that would end in unthinkable tragedy. By the time the sun rose again, the joyous celebration of their wedding would be overshadowed by a crime that left an entire community in shock. And for her, the truth she had sought would come at the ultimate cost. The wedding night, the night that was meant to mark the beginning of their happily ever after. For most newlyweds, it's a time of closeness, of sharing dreams and planning a future together. But for her, the night had become a heavy burden, a moment she could no longer ignore. The questions that had been simmering in her mind all day surged to the surface, demanding answers. She could feel her heart racing as she walked into the quiet of their shared home, still echoing with the faint remnants of the day's celebration. As the door clicked shut behind them, she could sense that this wasn't just a night like any other. She had already made up her mind. She would confront him, finally get the truth that had eluded her. The hidden files in his office, the strange notes, the secretive phone calls. It had all led to this moment. Her eyes flickered to the desk in the corner, where a folder sat, partially open. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved with determination as she slid the drawer open, her pulse quickening. Inside, she found the folder, its contents filled with documents she never thought she'd see. Names, dates, photographs, and more that sent a chill down her spine. But it was one email in particular that caught her breath. The subject line read, "Operation Salvage, urgent action required." With trembling hands, she opened the email. The contents were even worse than she imagined. It wasn't just about drugs, as she had feared. No, this was far worse. The email outlined a detailed plan, one that involved illegal surgeries and the harvesting of human organs. The network he was tied to targeted vulnerable individuals, offering them hope in exchange for their lives. It was the kind of operation that thrived in the shadows, where the lives of innocent people were bartered for profit. Her mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what she had uncovered. The sheriff, the man she had married just hours ago, wasn't just hiding his criminal activities. He was part of a chilling underground network. This wasn't a man of honor or integrity, as everyone believed. This was a man who had blood on his hands, and now she knew. With the evidence in hand, the truth burned inside her. She had to confront him. She had to make him admit the horror of what he had done. She found him in the living room, pacing nervously, clearly unaware of the bombshell she was about to drop. She held the folder in her hands as she approached him, her voice steady but filled with anger. "I know everything," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I know what you've been doing." He froze. For a moment, his eyes betrayed nothing but confusion, then fear. He took a step back, his expression faltering. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice too calm, too controlled for someone in his position. "Don't lie to me," she spat, opening the folder and revealing the email. "I have the proof. You've been involved in organ harvesting. You've been running a network of illegal surgeries, exploiting innocent lives for money. How could you do this?" He looked at the documents, his face draining of color. For a long, tense moment, there was silence, the only sound being the quickening rhythm of her heartbeat. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant for it to get this far." His eyes locked onto hers, filled with desperation. "Please don't do this. Don't expose me. You have no idea what they'll do to you. They'll kill us both." Her heart skipped a beat. The terror in his voice wasn't one of fear for himself. It was for her. She took a step back, trying to process his words. "You think I'll stay silent? After everything I've seen? After everything you've done?" His face twisted, a flicker of panic flashing across his features. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he pleaded. "You don't know the people behind this. If you go to the authorities, they'll make sure you disappear. Just let it go. For both of us." But there was no turning back. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, had shown his true face. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was clear. "Number, I won't let you get away with this." That's when the panic truly set in. In a flash, the man who had once sworn to protect others, who had sworn to protect her, lunged toward her, his eyes wild, his hands shaking. "You don't understand," he screamed. "I can't let you ruin everything. I won't let you ruin me." She took a step back, her body tensing. But before she could react, he was already closing the distance between them. His desperation had crossed into something far darker. His breath was hot on her neck as he whispered, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're forcing me to do." The moment hung heavy in the air, and for her, time seemed to slow. She could see it in his eyes, the shift, the coldness that replaced the man she once knew. This was no longer a husband pleading for mercy. This was a man who had crossed a line and would stop at nothing to protect his secret. The confrontation was electric, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The sheriff stood a few feet away from his wife, his mind racing, his pulse quickening, his hands slightly trembling with both fear and resolve. He had always been calm under pressure, years of dealing with criminals, tracking down the worst of the worst. But this was different. This was his wife, the woman he had once sworn to protect. Yet, she was now a threat that needed to be eliminated. Her voice wavered, but there was steel in it, her eyes wide with realization. "You're involved in something far worse than I thought, aren't you? I found the files. I know what you've been doing. I won't stay quiet. I'll tell everyone." The words, so full of betrayal and accusation, burned through him. His chest tightened. There was no turning back now. If she went to the authorities, everything he had worked for would be destroyed. His career, his reputation, his entire life, gone in an instant. She had to be silenced, but he couldn't let her know what was coming. He couldn't let her fight back. As he stood there, her voice still ringing in his ears, he saw the glint of determination in her eyes. She knew too much, and she was ready to expose it all. The moment she reached for her phone, he saw the panic in her movements, her fingers trembling as she prepared to make a call. He knew it was now or never. The plan needed to be set in motion. His mind clicked into detective mode, recalling the countless situations where things had gone wrong simply because of a misstep, a rushed decision. His career in law enforcement had taught him how to handle pressure, and now it was time to apply that same calmness to his darkest moment. She's scared. I need to calm her down, make her believe I'm still the man she trusted, the man she married. I need to subdue her without her suspecting a thing. The sheriff's eyes flickered to the bedside table. The bottle of sleeping pills sat there innocently, her prescribed medication for occasional insomnia. She had taken them before, trusted them to help her sleep during those long, restless nights. She had no idea how close they were to becoming an instrument of her death. He had to act swiftly, and he had to act now. But he couldn't just force the pills down her throat. That would raise too many questions. No, he needed something subtler, something she wouldn't even suspect. A careful plan formed in his mind. He could use the same method he had seen used countless times in his investigations, something that looked like an accident, an oversight. He could slip the pills into her drink, make it look like a simple case of her taking too many. No one would question it, not even the most experienced detectives. He had seen it all too often. An unknowing victim, a careless mistake, a tragic end. But the real trick, he knew, was making her take the pills willingly. She had to believe it was safe. He couldn't let her fight back, couldn't let her see the truth. He had to play the part of the husband who was only trying to calm her down, trying to convince her to stop making accusations. Think. His mind raced. She was standing there, still holding the phone, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. He had to get closer. He had to get her to sit down, to listen to him. His voice softened, as if he were trying to reassure her, trying to bring her back to the comfort she had once felt. Please, just listen to me. I know this looks bad. I know you're scared. But I love you. We can get through this together. Let's talk. Calm down. He stepped toward her slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements smooth and controlled. She was still holding the phone, but he could see the hesitance in her eyes. She wasn't fully convinced. She was still thinking of ways to escape, to reach out for help. The clock was ticking, and every second was precious. He moved with purpose, taking a seat next to her. His hand brushed lightly against hers, his fingers just grazing her skin. Please, just put the phone down. We can talk. We can fix this. I promise. Her gaze flickered to the glass of water on the nightstand, and without hesitation he took it, adding the crushed sleeping pills in a subtle motion, just enough to ensure they would dissolve in the liquid. The effect would be almost immediate. He watched her face as he handed her the glass, noting the way she stared at it, the doubt still clouding her features. I'm not going to hurt you. Just drink this. It will help you relax. You've been through so much tonight, and you need to rest. His voice was calm, reassuring, but inside, his heart pounded as he watched her lift the glass to her lips. She hesitated just for a moment, as if searching his face for any sign of deception. But the sheriff had perfected the art of hiding his true intentions. His expression was calm, even soothing, as he waited for her to take the drink. Please, just drink it. Trust me. She took the glass from him, her fingers shaking. The sheriff's breath caught in his chest, but he kept his demeanor steady. She took a sip, then another. His eyes never left her, watching for the moment when the drugs would take hold. At first, it seemed nothing was happening, but soon her eyelids began to droop, her body sinking into the chair as the sedatives began to work. She tried to fight it, tried to keep her mind alert, but the medication was already taking effect. She struggled to keep her focus, her thoughts blurring, but the sheriff knew she didn't stand a chance. The look in her eyes was a mix of confusion and fear. What have you done? She whispered, her voice weak, trembling. She tried to stand, but her legs wavered beneath her. The sheriff stood and guided her back down gently, as if he were just helping her rest. Her breaths became slower, deeper, and finally she slumped into the chair, her body too heavy to resist the drugs. It's almost over, he thought, his pulse still racing, but his actions calm and precise. She was too drowsy to respond now, her head lolling to the side as the last of her strength left her. He watched her closely, his mind still calculating, still considering his next move. Her fate was sealed. No one would know what had really happened. The sheriff's life, the perfect life he had built, would continue. There was no turning back now. As the sheriff stepped back from the body, he realized the final part of the plan, leaving no trace of himself behind. He had handled the situation with cold precision, but now he needed to ensure that his fingerprints wouldn't betray him. His mind was already moving toward his next steps, the ones that would leave the investigation directionless and confused. He glanced at the bedside table, where he had placed the bottle of sleeping pills. He'd been careful not to touch it directly, but now he double-checked to make sure there were no smudges left behind. If there had been, it wouldn't have mattered. He had already wiped them clean. He had used a cloth to handle it earlier, ensuring that he hadn't left anything identifiable. The pillow had been the key tool in the murder. He had been meticulous with it, making sure that there were no signs of struggle, no marks to show that it had been used in such a violent manner. He carefully folded the pillow back into place, not once touching the area that had come in contact with her face. The slightest smudge could ruin the entire plan, so he used a pair of gloves for that part. He knew how to be precise, how to avoid even the smallest of errors. He moved quietly through the room, his gloves leaving no evidence of his presence. The bedroom was now an almost pristine crime scene, save for the tragedy that had unfolded. The key to avoiding suspicion would be making sure he touched nothing that could be connected to him, including her phone or any other items that could have been moved. He had already hidden her phone, and now he wiped down the surfaces around the room, making sure there was no trace of his hands on the dresser, the bed, or even the door handle. His next step was checking the window, which he had cracked open earlier to give the illusion of a natural death. He closed it carefully, ensuring not to leave any marks on the frame. He'd also made sure to leave just enough of a gap for anyone to think it had been disturbed in the night, perhaps from a fresh breeze. When he turned his attention to the door, he realized the knob could be problematic. He quickly wiped it down with a cloth, his fingers working in practiced movements, erasing any chance of a fingerprint being left behind. He knew that any physical evidence could lead back to him, and in his profession, no detail was too small to ignore. The most crucial part was the final act of discovery. He had to make sure that when he found her body, there was no possibility of him having touched anything at all. As he stepped away from her body, he allowed himself one last moment to process the scene. He wiped down his own hands, just to be sure, even though they had never come in direct contact with the body or any other surface besides the door and the pills. As he began to prepare for the discovery, his mind ran through the steps of his next moves. He would call the authorities soon, his tone full of panic, pretending to have just stumbled upon her lifeless body. By the time they arrived, he would be the distraught husband, the one who had no idea what had happened. But for now, the important thing was that no one would ever connect the dots. No fingerprints, no smudges, no trace of him anywhere. It's over. It's done. And with that, he slipped back into the role of the grieving husband, ready to play his part in the investigation that would soon follow. As the weight of his actions settled into his bones, the sheriff knew he had to act quickly. He had carefully constructed the scene, the narrative, and now all that was left was to follow through with the final step, drawing attention to the crime. The clock was ticking, and though every instinct screamed at him to remain in control, he couldn't help but feel the creeping dread of what was to come. He had murdered his wife, but the investigation was just beginning. With steady hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was thick with feigned shock as he spoke to the dispatcher. He made sure his tone was unsteady, just enough to seem like someone in emotional distress, but not so much that it would sound forced. His words were clipped, yet deliberately tinged with panic. "There's been a break-in," he said, his voice trembling slightly, as though the very thought of the crime made his chest tighten. I found my wife unconscious. I think someone attacked her. She's not breathing. Please, you have to hurry." The dispatcher, sensing the urgency, instructed him to stay on the line. He complied. He had wiped down everything. The pills had been carefully hidden in a drawer. The chair was in the right position, the blanket on the couch just as it had been before. His fingerprints had been wiped away from every surface. He had made sure of it. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The sheriff's heart rate didn't falter. He had prepared himself for this moment. He would appear helpless, a man overwhelmed by grief, desperate for answers. His job was to direct the investigation where he wanted it to go, and to keep his composure long enough to ensure the police didn't dig too deeply. As the first officers rushed into the home, they found him standing just inside the door, looking every bit the part of a man who had just discovered a tragedy. "Please," the sheriff said, his voice cracking. "She's gone. She was just here, and now she's She's gone. Someone broke in. They must have done this. The officers moved quickly, securing the area and beginning their standard procedures. They asked him questions, basic, routine things at first. When did you find her? What were you doing before the discovery? The sheriff answered each one, his responses seemingly genuine, wrapped in layers of disbelief. He spoke of the moment he had found her, of his attempts to rouse her, but there was no use. His wife had been taken from him in the dead of night, and no one could have seen it coming. "Did you hear anything unusual?" one officer asked, his tone cautious but probing. "No," the sheriff replied, his gaze lingering on the body. The officers exchanged glances, noting the absence of forced entry. They moved through the house, carefully scanning for any signs of a struggle, any evidence that the scene wasn't as it appeared. But the place was eerily still. No broken windows, no ransacked rooms, just the body of the wife, lying there, lifeless. As they began to investigate further, the sheriff's mind was already racing. He kept his movements controlled, his demeanor in check. He knew that any sign of nervousness, any misstep, could cost him everything. The investigation was just beginning, and he had to make sure the police saw nothing but the surface. He couldn't afford for them to dig deeper, to ask the questions that might expose his lie. Within moments, the crime scene investigators arrived, setting up their equipment and preparing to document everything. The sheriff remained composed, directing their attention to the details he had already considered. The lack of forced entry, the untouched valuables, the pristine state of the home. He knew that if they focused on these things, they would be more likely to consider his story, a burglary gone wrong. But as the hours stretched on, cracks began to show. The sheriff's behavior, while initially convincing, started to raise suspicions. His answers seemed rehearsed, his movements too deliberate, almost as if he were in control of the situation rather than reacting to it. The officers and detectives began to notice that there was something off about the way he was handling himself. One of the detectives, a seasoned investigator with an intuition that couldn't be ignored, began to study the sheriff more closely. She watched his every move, noting the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he kept glancing at the body but never at the officers. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something too controlled, too calculated for a man who had just lost his wife. Still, they didn't have enough to make an arrest. The initial investigation continued, with the sheriff playing his part flawlessly, doing everything within his power to maintain the facade. But behind the scenes, the officers were already beginning to look deeper. They had started asking questions about his finances, his history, his relationships. They were finding inconsistencies, and the sheriff knew that it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the truth. But for now, he remained the picture of a man shattered by grief, a husband who had lost his wife under tragic and violent circumstances. And in that silence, in the hours that followed, the investigation crept closer to the truth, even though the sheriff thought he had managed to stay one step ahead. He had killed his wife and covered his tracks, but the investigation was just beginning, and in the end, no one could outrun the consequences of their actions forever. The investigation, which had initially been brushed aside as a routine domestic tragedy, began to take a darker turn as the days went on. What seemed at first like a tragic accident, an unfortunate overdose, or a sudden health crisis, soon gave way to inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. The authorities had quickly noted that there were no signs of forced entry into the home, which was expected in a case of robbery or break-in. What stood out more than anything was the wife's death being so isolated, so personal. It was clear. Only one person could have been responsible, and that person was her husband, the sheriff. At first, the sheriff played his part well. He was the grieving husband, broken by the sudden loss of his wife, her death so untimely, so shocking. He was cooperative with the investigators, answering their questions without hesitation. There was no sign of guilt or deceit in his eyes. He kept his story consistent and made no attempt to deviate from the narrative he had already set in motion. To the outside world, he was the man who had lost everything. But in the privacy of his own mind, the sheriff knew that his life had not been turned upside down. His carefully constructed world had been shattered, but only because the walls were closing in on him. The investigators, however, weren't so easily fooled. Small things, tiny clues that anyone else might have overlooked, started to make them question the story they had been fed. The absence of struggle at the crime scene, the lack of defensive wounds on the wife's body, the perfectly placed sleeping pills, all of it pointed in one direction. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a simple case of overdose. The wife had been murdered, and the sheriff was the one with the most to gain. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the situation became. Forensic evidence soon revealed traces of drugs on surfaces that the sheriff had insisted he hadn't touched. Fingerprints that had been expertly wiped clean were now showing up in places they shouldn't have been. And the sheriff's calm demeanor, while initially a sign of grief, began to raise red flags. He knew how investigations worked, and it was becoming clear that he was far more knowledgeable than most suspects. In fact, he knew exactly how to evade detection. Still, what would have been an easy case for most detectives became an increasingly frustrating puzzle. No clear motive, no definitive evidence linking him directly to the murder. It was as if the sheriff was 2 steps ahead of the investigation at all times. That's when the anonymous tip came, a small but significant piece of the puzzle that would set the whole investigation into motion. It came through the department's anonymous tip line. "The sheriff isn't what he seems. Look deeper. Follow the money. There's more to this than you think." The message was brief, cryptic, and unsettling. But it was the nudge the investigators needed to look beyond the surface of a grieving husband and start looking into a much larger, much darker world. A world the sheriff had tried so desperately to keep hidden. At first, the authorities were hesitant. After all, an anonymous tip could be just that, someone trying to sow discord without any real evidence. But when they dug deeper, they discovered the first clue that confirmed their worst fears. There were missing persons cases that were eerily connected to the sheriff. The names on the list were individuals who had seemingly disappeared off the radar without any explanation. Some were street dwellers, some were addicts, others were people with questionable pasts. No one would have thought twice about their disappearances. Except now, in the context of this new information, the connections between these people began to add up. As the investigators traced the sheriff's movements, they found that he had played a much larger role in these disappearances than they had initially thought. It wasn't just the wife's death that needed to be questioned. It was the string of missing persons cases that spanned years. Each one had a connection to him. Each one was linked through his office, through his access to law enforcement resources. It was then they realized that these people hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken. And the sheriff had used his position to cover it up, to ensure that no one would ask too many questions. The deeper they went, the more they uncovered. A network, carefully hidden under layers of deceit, unfolded before their eyes. Financial transactions that didn't make sense, money flowing into offshore accounts, medical records that linked the sheriff to doctors who had no business operating outside the law. It was all connected. A vast, illegal organ trafficking ring that the sheriff had been running for years, using his position to exploit vulnerable individuals. He had used the same methods, the same careful manipulation, to silence anyone who got too close to discovering the truth. The investigators also found communication between the sheriff and several black market surgeons. These messages, encrypted and carefully hidden, detailed the procedures, who would be taken, who would receive the harvested organs, and how the payments would be made. The operation had been running under the radar for so long that no one had ever suspected the sheriff was involved. The more they discovered, the more horrifying it became. The wife had been silenced not because she had discovered the sheriff's drug dealings, but because she had started to piece together the truth about the organ trafficking operation. She had known something wasn't right, had begun asking too many questions, and in the sheriff's mind, she was a liability. Her death wasn't just about protecting his drug empire. It was about stopping her from exposing the horrors he was orchestrating in plain sight. The sheriff's meticulousness in covering his tracks had almost worked. But in the end, it was the smallest of details, the missing link, the anonymous tip, that set the investigation on the right path. As they uncovered more and more of his double life, the sheriff's carefully constructed world began to fall apart. What had seemed like an isolated tragedy was now a gateway to one of the most disturbing criminal operations in the county's history. And as the investigation moved forward, it became clear. This wasn't just about a murdered wife anymore. This was about the lives of countless others, victims who had been silenced and discarded by the very person who was supposed to protect them. The sheriff's carefully crafted persona of a righteous lawman had been shattered, and the truth was finally coming to light. The pieces were all in place, the evidence, the connections, the motive. And as the investigation reached its crescendo, the sheriff's fate hung in the balance, his darkest secrets exposed for the world to see. The investigation reached its peak when law enforcement officers, armed with a mountain of evidence, finally confronted the sheriff. His days of carefully constructed lies and manipulations had come to an end. For months, he had been living with the comfort of knowing his criminal activities were hidden beneath layers of authority and respect. But now, with undeniable proof in hand, the truth was about to be laid bare. As the sheriff sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his confident demeanor began to falter. The detectives, calm and methodical, began their approach, presenting the first pieces of evidence. Financial records showing suspicious transactions, messages between the sheriff and known drug dealers, and medical records linking him to the illegal organ trafficking operation. The sheriff's once unshakable composure began to crack. "We've got all of it," one of the investigators stated plainly. "The money, the drugs, the organs. You've been living a double life, Sheriff. And we know you were involved in your wife's death. There's no way out now." The sheriff remained silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, trying to find some way to escape the reality of the situation. But there was no escape. The evidence was overwhelming. A final bombshell came when they revealed the toxicology report from his wife's autopsy, showing traces of the sleeping drug he had used to render her unconscious before he murdered her. The realization set in. There was no way to deny his involvement. The sheriff slumped in his chair, his bravado gone, replaced by a sense of inevitable defeat. He had been caught, exposed, and there was no escaping the consequences now. Slowly, the sheriff's lips parted, and with a sigh, he began to confess. "I did it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was involved in the drug deals. I ran the organ trafficking ring. And yes, I killed her. She found out too much. She was going to expose everything. I had no choice." The confession was chilling in its simplicity. The sheriff had orchestrated the entire operation, using his position as law enforcement to cover his tracks and silence those who threatened to expose him. He admitted to his wife's murder, to the countless lives he had destroyed, and to the horrifying world of illegal trade he had been a part of for years. With his confession on record, the investigation moved quickly. The sheriff was charged with multiple counts of murder, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and organized crime. His once sterling reputation as a lawman crumbled in an instant. The case went to trial, and the courtroom was filled with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. How could a man entrusted with the law have fallen so far? How many had he hurt? How many had he destroyed, all for his own gain? In the courtroom, as the judge read out the charges, The sheriff's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for mere hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The shock of his conviction reverberated throughout the community. People were left to wonder how someone so trusted, so respected, could have been capable of such horrors. But the truth was undeniable. The sheriff had used his position of power to destroy countless lives, and now he would face the consequences. Sentenced to life in prison, the sheriff was escorted from the courtroom, his face a mask of resignation. His crimes had been too great, his betrayal too deep. The community was left to pick up the pieces, to reckon with the fact that the man they had trusted had been nothing more than a monster hiding in plain sight. As the final gavel fell, a few lingering questions hung in the air, ones that no verdict or sentence could answer. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What would you have done if you were in her position? How could a man so deeply embedded in a system of justice have been capable of such evil? What is the true cost of trust when it's built on lies? These are the questions we must all ask ourselves as we reflect on the story of the sheriff who thought he could get away with everything. A man who once stood at the top, only to fall from grace in the most spectacular way. What could have been done to stop him before it was too late? What lessons can we learn from this chilling case? Could we ever have known what lay beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life? If you've been captivated by this story, we want to hear your thoughts. Could this tragedy have been avoided? How do you think justice can be served in a case like this? Share your opinions, your reflections, and your questions in the comments below.